I've tried to teach on irony or even humor in the Bible, one of the first challenges is getting people to realize that there is like irony.
Right.
Irony would be a subset of humor, but that there's humor in the Bible, intentional humor, because people rightly want to respect the Bible. They have this holy aura that they're like, well, this is the Bible. But when we start to open ourselves up to the reality that maybe there is more humor in the Bible, it's not so much that you want to protect it in this glass case, but really accessing the Bible and reading the passages as they were intended, as they were written. Humor, especially irony, was used in that communication. And so if we don't read a passage with an ironic set of glasses on, then we could potentially miss what's being communicated.
So true. All right. So we've just stumbled upon irony in the Bible. What should we look for or notice?
Sure. Two competing types of humor that I think would be easily confused: irony and satire.
Okay.
When we see humor that pokes fun at a distance at somebody, I would label that more as a satire type of humor, because that's me as the speaker differentiating myself from whoever I'm poking fun at. Or you see this with political cartoons and those kinds of things. But irony, what we see, I think, much more frequently in the Bible is it's a critiquing kind of humor, but it also has like one arm around the audience. It's more of a relational. It's more of like, we're in this together, but I'm using this irony to communicate to you, to get a message across. So I guess the first thing is to just in differentiating those two types of humor. Now, that I think clues us in a bit as to places where we can watch for irony in situations where there's a critique happening. Very often in the prophets, you're going to come across ironic rebukes. Another example, this is a little bit more of a technical book.
But The Irony of Galatians.
This author's argument is that the entire book, The Irony of Galatians, is an ironic rebuke of the Galatian church. And Paul is using humor, a bit of a barbed humor, in order to get their attention and in some ways to kind of shame them into, guys, you know better kind of thing. It would be analogous to a parent saying, okay, we're going out on a date this weekend, kids, keep the place clean. Do not throw a party. Do not have your friends over. Do not make a mess. And you come home, sure enough, it's a mess. And you're like, what did you do? Well, you know what they did, but you're using this as a way to kind of critique and bring them into corrective behavior.
Got it.
So that's, I guess that's how, or just one example in how you can start to identify irony.
Do you think too that as we're reading, if there's something that really just doesn't make sense to us, that could also be a clue to irony? Let me just share an example. Sure. I've been studying the story that Jesus shared with Simon at his dinner party, where the woman is at Simon's feet and, weeping at his feet. And then Jesus tells the story about the two debtors. And then he closes by saying, the one who was forgiven little, obviously loves little. And he's saying with his words, he's saying, Simon, you have sinned so little. But then with all the examples he's just given, given hospitality being so much prioritization given to hospitality in the Middle East, like his examples show that Simon has really been rude and disrespectful and dishonoring. So there is this irony. This is irony, yes?
Yeah, when you have a divergence between what's being said and what's actually playing out.
Oh, there you go.
There's another clue that you could be seeing irony.
Yes, because that's what I was like, okay, he is saying Simon has little love because he's had little offense. Sure. But he's giving examples of how the woman has actually shown great honor and respect, and Simon
Mm-hmm.
has had great offense. And so it
Mm-hmm.
just did not add up until in my conversation with Erica Wiggenhorn, she was, we're having this conversation and she mentions irony. And I'm like, oh, I think that's what's going on here. I think that was the missing piece. And that just was like unlocking the door for me to understand that story.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm just curious, like, is there anything else we can look for when we're just approaching scripture and trying to see where we might miss the humor or the irony? Any other tips you can give us with that?
Yeah, the best ways to be looking, I think, are pay attention to the context, and that's a multi-level requirement because there's cultural context, there's the story or the narrative context, like what you were describing. You've got the events are playing out this way, but the characters are saying something here. So you have that context. There can be some in the language that's chosen, the linguistic, the historical. All of these different levels of context are very helpful in watching. I think probably though, like the one you keyed in on, that's probably the easiest one to identify, because you're seeing like, oh, these two things don't make sense. But if you stop and say, well, let me just ask myself, if I was to see this person, if they were kind of saying it with a little bit of a twinkle in their eye, or maybe a little bit of a, like a parent would be rebuking, then it starts to make sense. And that was an acceptable mode of communication for those people in that time.
And in that culture, are they less direct? Do they use irony and humor because they're less direct?
I don't know. In some ways, yes. In other ways, no. One example, as I was preparing for this, Isaiah 6, I would say would be another ironic rebuke moment. And I would say this is very direct. This is the famous passage where Isaiah sees the Lord high and exalted, and the seraphim are flying around. And God says, who will go for me? And Isaiah says, here am I. And what does he say next? He's like, go and tell this people, be ever hearing, never understanding, be ever seeing. If you say it, like, if you realize God was being very direct, so direct that it was almost like on the nose, but the people still weren't getting it, even though they were being told, you're not getting it. They were just so callous. So in that instance, I think God was being very direct. It was an ironic rebuke, but even at that point, the people were like, probably, getting offended, where it was making them even more hard-hearted. But God's pointing out exactly what they're doing. So yes and no, I think.
Okay. I just know for myself that when there's a misunderstanding, and when I am approaching something and just saying, I don't understand, I don't see the problem, if I will humble myself, the clarity comes. And perhaps there's, in the approaching with irony, there's an invitation to humble yourself and listen in a new way. Do you think?
Yeah, for sure. And that's where we start to open our own hearts and minds to what the message is that God's trying to communicate. And that can be hard, because oftentimes the ironic rebuke feels a little bit like a backhanded, like, ooh, that's harsh, when Isaiah was speaking those words. But like, we can also be those people who are ever hearing but never understanding. Like, so it's a time where we have to take a good gut check.
Yeah, that's so good. Anything else you wanted to add about irony?
I think a place that people could, maybe a good first place to go, I really started on the journey of looking at humor in the Bible by reading and studying the book of Jonah. I think in Jonah, you find a lot of situational irony. You have a prophet who is probably the worst prophet of the Lord, with how he acts, and his obedience is not good.
And yet the outcome is amazing.
The outcome's amazing, and all of that in spite of his terrible obedience and his lip service that he gives to God. And
right, I've noticed in the first chapter, he says, I fear the Lord, like I fear God, and yet they're the ones who are trembling. He's
exactly.
the
So you
one
have this.
turning his back and running.
Yep. You have
and
a
saying,
very.
I fear God.
I know, and yeah, he comes across as arrogant and foolish, and you compare, like, his words are what the pagan sailors are actually doing. So it's like his
Exactly.
words and his actions don't line up. And
And do we think that Jonah wrote Jonah?
that's a good
Okay.
discussion. Some people have said, maybe one of his disciples wrote it after the fact. I could see, even, I don't think it's far-fetched to say he wrote it maybe afterwards. It would be a bit of a humbling, like, autobiographical, like, yeah, I totally messed up, and here's the lesson I learned, going through it. So it's totally a possibility, either him or his disciples.
Interesting. Well, this has been fascinating, and I so appreciate your time, Bryan, and so appreciate your family. I'll just mention that your wife works with me and supports my ministry. So grateful just that we can partner together.
Yes, likewise.